I'm Mike Kelzer. Growing up in my family's pharmacy, the moments that stuck were the business conversations with my dad. This podcast continues those conversations. No scripts, no fluff, just honest insights into the business of pharmacy. I'll be here each week. I hope you'll join me. Tim, introduce yourself to our listeners.
Tim Ulbrich, co-founder and CEO of Your Financial Pharmacist. We work with pharmacists at all stages of their career, from just getting started to retirement and everything in between, at the intersection of pharmacy and finance. My passion, my mission, my work is focused on financial wellness. Graduated in 2008, came out with way too much student loan debt, had no idea what I was doing, taught myself personal finance, made a lot of mistakes along the way, and looked up and said, hey, this shouldn't be that hard, and would love to teach other pharmacists from those mistakes and what I was learning along the way. So we've been at it now for about 10 years.
You guys do amazing work. Through LinkedIn, I'm seeing some stuff on your posts occasionally. And as I go down, I see sometimes a combination of mortgage stuff and then the pharmacist salaries, maybe up in dollars, but down in value kind of thing. And it got me thinking that my wife and I, we bought a little house. This is back in the early 90s. We bought a house kind of next to the pharmacy, a mile away. It was $70,000 roughly. So we have the house for 10 years. We double the value. We sell it for roughly $140. And we're thinking, well, we did pretty well on that, a little bit less than $140, but just for round numbers. And I said to Margaret, I'm like, there's no way in hell this thing goes to $280. It's just not going to happen. It could never go to $280. Well, here 20 years later now, it's at $280. But as I think of pharmacists starting salaries, back when I started, let's say it's $40,000. Okay, let's say that went to $80,000. But I don't think the average pharmacist salary is $160. And so you tell me, but it seems like the houses have quadrupled. The salaries have not quadrupled. Plus there's other inflation and things like that in there. So it seems like, sadly, with all my kids, it kind of seems like the middle class, or I'm not sure exactly what class, but it seems a hell of a lot harder than when we got out years ago. This episode is sponsored by Remedy Chain, a nonprofit giving medications a second chance. Pharmacies can donate overstock, and families can give back by donating sealed, in-date meds. Don't let good medicine go to waste. Learn more at donatemymeds.org.
Yeah, I think the data supports that, Mike. I think the feeling is real. I get the chance to talk with pharmacists every day at all different seasons, from I'm getting ready to go into retirement, and am I ready? Am I not ready? What's this going to look like? I had a paycheck my whole career, and now I got to find a way to pay myself a paycheck. What about inflation, and what's going to happen to Social Security, right? All the questions. And then there's the group on the front end, which I think is really unique to what we're talking about here today, that are looking up saying, I get it. I'm going to make $120, $130, $140, depending on where I live. But by the way, have you seen what my student loan debt is? Have you seen what home prices are? And actually, when you run the numbers, when you look at what those two things alone, and if I could add a third and fourth that I typically see result in someone saying, hey, I make a good income, but I don't feel like I have any margin, it would be childcare costs and then car payments. Specifically the home, right? We're talking about a 30-year mortgage. Student loans, often these are hanging around 10 plus years. And then childcare costs are just extravagant, right? Often we see a lot of households, 2 working parents, not always the case, but significant childcare costs that are involved. And so they're asking this question, hey, I went and did a doctorate level program. Maybe I spent 6, 8 plus years. I was under this impression that because I'm a pharmacist, I'm going to make a good income, and therefore I'm going to be okay financially. And one of the things I try to shout from the mountaintops is a 6-figure income is not a financial plan. Now, I still believe, Mike, and people out in, the West Coast, Northeast, and in the DC area are going to say, but Tim, you don't understand, right? Cost of living. I still believe that even with the challenges we're talking about, a pharmacist today making the income that they're making on average, if we have the right perspective and planning, I still think the path is there for them to be financially successful. But I do think it's a lot harder. And just to kind of add my own story onto yours, I graduated in 2008, had a little over $200,000 of debt, as I mentioned a little while ago. We bought our first home in 2009 for $176,500. It's a number you never forget, right? Your first home purchase. And I remember thinking the same thing. Like, we live in this small town in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. Like, how much is this actually going to appreciate? Because you look at all the historical rates of appreciations of homes and you find all the reasons why it's not going to apply to your own house. And sure enough, it has, plus some. You know, you're talking about kind of the doubling numbers. We would end up moving in 2018 here to Columbus. And I remember buying our home here in Columbus at $345,500. And I remember seeing the 4.25% interest rate after we had a 3 point whatever on our first home. And I'm like, 4.25%, this is crazy talk, right? And we would end up refinancing in 2020 down to 3%. And here we are now, you know, at interest rates and continue to stay in the high sixes. But to the point that you're making, Pharmacist income, just to give you a data point, $2,069,440 was the mean. $69,440 was the mean. 2000, okay? 2010, it jumped up to $109,380. So we went from about, let's call round number 70 to 110 in a decade. Now, what propelled that? Well, we went, remember, to the required PharmD. We went to what was the report that said we're going to have a mass shortage of pharmacists, sign-on bonuses, salary shot up, right? That happened in that window. Then we go to 2020 and we go from about 110, let's call it 2010, to 125 in 2020. So you can start to see the slowing down that happened. Really a flattening or decrease if we add inflation, especially through the pandemic years coming off of 2020, 2021. And then here we are in 2024, we're at 137. Now, point of reference, if people want to look into this more, this data comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is a mean, and we know that means have problems, right? Means don't account for some of the extreme salary ranges we may see. And there are pharmacists that are out on the extremes. Let's be clear about that. So a median is probably a better number, but it's not too far off from this. Doesn't account for different areas of the country, doesn't account for years of experience, doesn't account for type of position. So take the data for what it is. But nonetheless, if I look at from my career, graduating in 2008, you know, to where shortly after someone was, you know, averaging about 109, 110 to today's value, I look at that and say, well, 110 to 137, if you just look at the numbers, yeah, pharmacists make more. But ... what about even just the historical rate of inflation, which of course we've seen much greater than that here recently? When you start to factor that in, plus the appreciation of homes, and the thing we're not talking about with homes, in my opinion, is it's not just the interest rate, it's the interest rate plus the appreciation that's happened over a period of time. What does that mean? Well, that means you need a bigger down payment. That means your monthly payment. And what's happening to property taxes, by the way? All of these trickle effects with these things that happen. So do pharmacists still objectively make a good income? I think they do. But is the purchasing power today what it was 10 years ago? It's not. It's just not. And it's typically because of the student loan debt, because of the home purchase, and childcare costs are really the top three things that we see that, you know, personal finance is simple math. If you make $7,000 a month of take-home pay and you have $5,000 tied up in fixed costs, there just isn't much breathing room. There's not much options to save, invest, compound time value money, or to do all the other things that we want to do. And so what typically happens in the people I talk with is they wake up 5, 7, 10 years in, they're like, you know, I've made $500,000, $1 million plus of income. I don't feel like I've gone anywhere. And I feel like I'm stuck. Furthermore, the words I'll often hear is, I feel like I'm living paycheck to paycheck. How is this possible?
Yeah.
It's possible because of what we're talking about here.
Everybody lives up to their paycheck. I say to myself, why is so-and-so doing a TV commercial, you know, or why is so-and-so still on the road with this or that band?
Mm-hmm.
It's like people live up to it. And on a smaller scale with pharmacists, you get the good pharmacy job, but you got to get a better car because it's further away, and you got to get the childcare, and you got to get the clothes for the pharmacy and all that. And these celebrities are doing the same thing, just on a higher scale, you know, so they all live up to it.
It's the same behavior. It's the same behavior.
On the housing, this is probably exaggerated, but between the inflation of the housing and the rates going up, it's like people are getting like a quarter of the value that they did for their monthly purchase than they did, you know, whatever, 10 years ago. It's not like half. It's like, I don't know all the funky math, but it's like a quarter. My children, you know, it's like they're making it on their own, but the housing costs just seem extremely high to me. It does matter what part of the country you're into.
Totally. It totally does. I think if I could add one more variable in there, and I'll put myself in the group, you know, this is not a statement of judgment, but it feels like, as I overgeneralize a little bit, it feels like there's a generation that expected to come out and live at the home. My parents, it took them 30 years to get the home where I came out and said, this is the home that we want. Right. And so there's an expectation shift that has also happened. Now, to the defense of that, there's also even what you call a starter home is very expensive in terms of what you can get. But let me give you a couple numbers here for people that are listening, because I think what this really brings it to life of both appreciation of home value and interest rates. So if we go back to the good old days of 2020, when interest rates were 3% on a 30-year fixed rate, some people were in the high twos. At the time, lower than that on a 15. But if we talk about a 30-year rate, if you were to buy a $500,000 home and you put 20% down at a 3% rate, that would mean your monthly payment, just principal and interest, was somewhere around $1,700 a month. Okay, so if you think about Pharmacist take-home pay, about $7,000-ish, just round numbers, $1,700, right? We're looking at about a third-ish, a little bit more. If you were to try to achieve that same monthly payment, that same payment of $1,700 a month in the current rate environment that we're in today, that $500,000 home, to get that matching monthly payment, you'd have to buy at $320,000. But here's the problem. Homes are more expensive than they were 4 years ago, not less expensive. So not only would you have to get a lower home purchase to get that same monthly payment because of the interest rate, but it's that much harder to get a lower home payment because homes have continued to appreciate and the values have gone up for the last 5 years significantly. I mean, you think of the historical rate of appreciation of homes, round numbers, I typically think of 4%. It's been a lot more than 4%, in the last 5 years. So there's this double whammy effect that's going on. And then the market conditions are adding further pressure. So new build construction is behind. So this is simple supply and demand. And what about all the people that are nearing retirement, kids are out of the house, that normally they might say, hey, I might think about downsizing, but who wants to give up their 3% rate? So you have this supply-demand equilibrium issue that's going on. All the while, we've got other pressures with student loan debt and wage compression that's happening simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, as I think to my 1/4 value statement, I guess that kind of explains it, because round numbers, let's say it's 500,000, and then you'd have to find one for, I think, 329 or something you said. But the 329 house is, compared to what it was just a bit ago, that would be like a $230,000 house. In other words, when you're sitting in your living room, you're like, this place is 75% worse than I thought I would have, because the price is down and you're not getting as much for that money. So it's like, it's a beast. It's a beast right now on the home front.
Now, there is, of course, the counter argument that you might be able to refinance in the future. Are we going to stay at high 6s, 7s? Will that come down? You never want to make a 30-year decision on a hope or a wish that something's going to happen in the future. So now the argument is, so what am I supposed to do? Rent prices are going up because this is a trickle-down effect. So this is where I have a lot of empathy with the new graduates coming out, and why I'm so passionate about doing some of the education around this is I still do believe in my heart of hearts that these folks can be successful, but it requires a lot more. And we can't be living off of the advice of our preceptors. Like, those days are gone. So your preceptor that's telling you that, hey, you got to save 30% of your income. Well, they might have had $100,000 of debt, not $200,000. And their interest rate on their student loans might have been like 2.8%. Not, this fall, Mike, on unsubsidized loans, which are most of the graduate school loans, they were north of 8%. I mean, so we're just looking at such different economic conditions and times that, yes, you can be successful. However, it's a mindset shift. And unfortunately, in some parts of the country, that may be a little bit easier than others, right? I know that pharmacist salaries aren't going to translate, accordingly necessarily with cost of living.
Tim, back when we first got apartments and things, when we were younger, I was born in 66. So let's say early 90s, I'm 25 or something like that. When you got an apartment, you'd have to fill your car up and you'd have these stereo speakers, they were 2 feet by 3 feet. You had 2 of those. You had a turntable. You had to have a desktop computer. You had to have a spot for your photo albums. Radio Shack, I saw this a few years ago. They had an ad from 1984, and they say the phone has replaced the 20 things on this page. My point is, so as the phone replaced this page from Radio Shack, it almost seems like something has to click where this is kind of sci-fi, but the cars have to be mass produced like iPhones. And so that thing just plummet, and the housing goes to this, I don't know, tiny houses or something
Box
that
houses,
just plummets at something. It almost seems, I hate to say that, but it almost seems like something has to plummet, mass produced plummet to make this work. And you can't put your hopes on that. And that's where your business is so important, because you're like, yeah, maybe Mike, but we're dealing with reality here. So we have to go percent by percent, and it's got to be a plan and all that kind of stuff. But you look at it from my age and you're like, crap, what's happening?
Yeah. And what I hear you saying there is like, where's the pressure release valve going to come from? Right. Because it's simple math. When I'll walk through kind of a standard budget, unless you have two pharmacist household or two higher income earning professionals where you start to get to a scale where you mitigate some of these issues, you have a house that's spread across two incomes, those kinds of things. When you look at just a single pharmacist income, like the math doesn't lie. If you look at a very reasonable $400,000 home, a standard student loan debt, a normal car payment, normal childcare costs, there just isn't a whole lot of margin. And I think that's one of the realities that we have to, when I was talking about a mindset shift, when I graduated in 2008, this was still in the day of sign-on bonuses and new cars were showing up in the parking lot when people were at graduation. We joke about those stories are like still out there. And I still think we're on this tail end of like the expansion to the doctorate degree and like this persona of like pharmacists and this six-figure income. And we have to really challenge like, what is that and how far does that go and what does that mean? I still think a six-figure income can go a far way. But a six-figure income is not a ticket to like, you don't have to worry about anything financially. Now, the good news is, if we want to put some good news in this conversation, is the numbers, if you're starting some of this early, it doesn't actually take that much to be financially successful. Now, the big if is if you're able to start this early, and not everyone is able to do that, of course, for various reasons. But, time value of money and history of what has happened since the Great Depression, of course, times can change. Cycles will come and go. And while the reasons will be different, the outcome has been consistent over the last 90 to 100 years, at least. Not that that's predictive of the future, but that's the best we've got, at this point. And it doesn't take huge amounts and huge sacrifices to set yourself up in a position to be financially successful. And I think that's part of the story we have to rewrite. Is when I talk with a lot of pharmacists, especially those that are in that mid-career or later, but often those that are on the front end, if I were to say, hey, by the time we get to retirement, like, I think very well, you need to be a multimillionaire and, here's the plan to support it. Like, until I can actually show them the numbers, it's like wonky math, like, I don't believe it, right? Type of a thing. And, what we need to reshift is a story of like, it's not about becoming stupid rich. It's not about necessarily building a massive wealth, although some people will be successful in doing that. It's just about diligent planning. And if someone is able to, start saving 10, 15, 20% of their income, which I think is reasonable for a lot of pharmacists, especially doing that early in their career, a lot of pharmacists, I would show you a plan that when we get into the 40s, we should be hitting a net worth of $1 million or more. Very feasible. For a lot of reasons, people will get to that point and they'll wake up and say, hey, I'm 20 years in, I've earned a couple $1 million more of income. I don't have a lot to show for it. Well, now the work's a lot harder, going forward. So there is hope, but there are also real challenges.
Speaking about success and how to define that, I saw an article somewhere online. It talked about different levels of wealth. You say there's this level of richness and you feel that everybody lives the same once they're at whatever. Let's say 10 million a year or something like that. Yeah. Let's say 10 million income a year. Everybody lives the same. And they were showing these brackets like 10 million to 20 million, you live like this. 20 to 40, you live like this. 40 to 200, you live like this. And they were just showing that it's a lot different as it goes up. But then, Tim, my wife and I were down in Florida 6 months ago, and you look out to the bay and you see this yacht, and it's probably costing 10, 20 million, and you see a yacht next to it that's 1 foot longer. Yep. And I look at the yacht that's on the left that's a foot shorter, and I say they're envious.
Totally. Yeah.
No matter where you are, even if you got that yacht, you're always looking up, where's this and that. So there's different definitions of financial success. And as we're alluding to here, it's not the success of your parents necessarily.
No, but that's often the stories we carry with us.
Yeah, exactly.
so much of the financial work, especially when you look at the behavioral part, do we understand some of the money scripts and stories that we were raised with, the bad, the ugly, because they do have an influence. For some people, when we talk about $1 million or more, even if that were to show that that's not enough, that idea, because of how they grow, that's we can't talk about that. That's just a story. It's a money script. And, everyone's situation is different. And once we can tap into that and be in tune with that, we can start to see it for what it is and, take some of the good and rewrite some of the story of things we would want to change. But comparison, I think, is such a big part of that. And this is why I firmly believe that who you surround yourself with is such an indicator of where you're going to be going in terms of financial success. And here we're talking about, I think, really building a long-term successful financial plan. We're not talking about necessarily big time wealth, but finding that right balance of what we talk about, saving for tomorrow and living a rich life today. Both are important. But who are you surrounded with, and how are they spending their money, and what homes do they live, and what activities are they doing? It depends, and everyone's vision is different, but we have to first get clear on what do we want and why do we want it? Because until we define that, we're going to be flying at the whim of everything that's out there influencing us every hour of every day. But I think back to some of the happiest memories I have when our kids were younger, and it was some of our best friends. We'd get together on a Friday night, we'd order a pizza, and we'd put the kids to bed, and we'd hang out for 3 or 4 hours. Super inexpensive activity, but we were all on the same page of this is a valuable experience, for us. And if we were to go on vacations together, this is, what the budget is and how we're prioritizing it, and we're on the same page, together. And so who your circle is matters a lot.
I've got this funny picture of my late father, who was my business partner and so on. And you always hear about people saying, well, the kids, they have the nose in their phone. No one's communicating anymore. And I've got this picture of my dad. He was probably 50 at the time. And he's reading a Red Book magazine. That's a woman's magazine. I don't know if Red Book is still out there, but it's a woman's magazine. A woman's fashion kind of magazine and women's stories and things like that. And I have a picture of him up at our cottage reading it. I know that magazine was probably 6 or 7 years old. And here's my dad looking at the 6 or 7 years old women's magazine. The point is, we've always had our nose in stuff. That's just what people do. My brother is in advertising, and he would get free GQ magazines or something because of the people that would advertise a page in GQ. And they would bring those up to the cottage. And so I'd go up to the cottage, just a normal schmuck, up there with my flip-flops and a t-shirt and things like that. But Tim, I tell you, by the end of that week, reading a bunch of GQ magazines, I needed a new wristwatch.
Right.
It was just obvious, I need a wristwatch now, because you've seen ad after ad after ad. Going back to the point of who you're surrounding yourself with, and that's an age-old story of keeping up with the Joneses and so on. But there's some physician friends of ours, and I know the reason that they're going to the Cayman Islands and going to Disney and all that stuff is because it's no fun to come back, April 1st after spring break and have everybody else saying they went out of the country. And it's we went to South Dakota and saw Mount Rushmore or something like that. It does matter who you surround yourself with.
It really does. And this is why I think the vision piece is so important. And traditional financial planning leaves us out, right? Because let's jump into the investments and retirement and all of the things, that also are important. But money at the end of the day is a tool. And, money only has value because we all agree it has value. So what are we trying to do and accomplish? I always think of it as a rocking chair vision. When I look back, and hopefully if I'm 75, 80, looking at my kids and grandkids, what are those experiences? How do we use the money in a way that was really going to allow us to have the fulfilling experiences that we wanted? The literature really shows us is when you look at happiness and money, there's a great book out there called Happy Money from some academics, Elizabeth Dunn and her co-author, I'm drawing a blank on. They studied the connection between happiness and money and its experiences. These are the front runners when it comes to actually translating currency that is memorable, right? Isn't that what we're kind of all trying to do, right? Of course, there's other things. We need to make sure the money doesn't run out, all those things, take care of our family, et cetera. So I think this vision piece, though, if we don't define it, we're going to be off and running with the financial plan, and we're going to find ourselves saying, well, why are we spending money here and not here? And it might be that we realize it sooner, we might realize it later. And one of the personal finance authors that I love his work that I follow, Ramit Sethi, he wrote the book, I Will Teach You to Be Rich, which is a really good, just kind of introductory personal finance. But his opening chapter, he talks about this, it's called Money Dials. And his whole point is like, get clear on the things that you actually care about. So for him, the example is, he's like, I'm a convenience geek. So if I can invest in anything that's going to provide me with convenience, I'm willing to pay for it. So what is your thing or things that you care about and actually have meaning to you? And let's prioritize those and make sure we're funding those. But equally important, what are the things that you might be spending money on that you actually don't care about? The one that comes up a lot is cars, where, I might talk with someone who has $1,000 a month car payment. And I was like, what's going on? You must love cars. It's like, they've just kind of fallen into the $1,000 a month car payment. So it's sort of that, like, wake up. What are we passionate about? What do we care about? And are we spending our money accordingly? And then the things that we're not, let's pull back so we can allocate those to the things that actually do matter. Love that visual money dials, because I think to what we're talking about here with comparison, I think the result of comparison is we end up wandering into how we spend our money. We lose the intentionality, and then we wake up at some point in the future realizing like, we like missed the boat here. We thought this mattered, and it really didn't.
Well, and Tim, you probably know the psychological term for this, but it's where you wouldn't do something to gain $10. Like, as someone said, Tim, go out there and get my phone from the car. Your neighbor says that. It's like, nah, I'm not going to do that for $10. But you would do like triple that to not lose $10. You would maybe, return something. You'd go 5 miles to the store because, damn it, this was on sale for $10 and I paid $10 more for it, and I'm going to get that $10 back. I forget the psychological term, but it's the same $10. You don't care if you gain it, but you don't want to lose it, that kind of thing. And the point I'm making there is, it takes a lot of work to know what's important to you, because we might even think we know what's important to you. It's like, well, yeah, but why the hell do you drive 5 miles to get that $10 back when you wouldn't do that if someone gave it to you for getting their phone? That kind of stuff. We don't even know what we want sometimes. And that's where the value of really looking at it like you can guide people through matters.
Yeah, loss aversion is what you're referring to.
Loss aversion.
We feel the losses psychologically more than we feel the rewards. And this is why systems are so important in personal finance, because the greatest barrier typically to us achieving our financial goals is ourselves. It's human behavior. Dr. Daniel Crosby talks about this in his book, The Behavioral Investor, that number one variable that's likely to get in the way of you achieving your long-term investing plan is your own behaviors of what you do, because we're irrational human beings. So how do we hedge against that? We set our goals, we set our vision, we set our system, and we get the heck out of the way. And when you actually look at the data, nobody wants to hear this, because who wants to pay for a financial advisor or planner that's just helping them not make their own mistakes? But the actual true delta value, because of the risk that's in timing the markets. Look at the decisions people have made over the last month or two, that they're like, if you would have been sleeping for the last 3 months, you look up and say, nothing's happened in the markets this year. It's looked flat. But the number of decisions that have been made high and low, it's unbelievable, right? And that just speaks to, like, we can say all that we want, that we have the risk tolerance, but loss aversion tells us that we don't, because we feel the loss is greater than we feel the wins. And so what do? When the market's going up and it's in fuego, everyone jumps in to buy. It's the worst time you can buy. When the market goes down, we all bail ship. It's the worst time to lose, right? You don't have losses until you actually solidify your losses. But if you look at long term, the systems are the antidote to loss aversion. The work to be done is set the vision, set the goals, look at the spending plan and the budget, and then automate the heck out of it and get yourself out of the way. It sounds so easy, but it's so hard.
Yeah, I've had so many times in my life where I've worked out for a few months here and there. And 4 years ago, I said, damn it, I'm going to walk every morning. So I go out 4 to 5 times a week, 3.3 miles. It's my system. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I just do it. And though some of my kids will pop up, Dad, you should go to the gym. You should do this. You should do that. It's like, no, I got my system in place. I do it. I don't think about it. Do it whenever. And so it's the same thing with eating, exercise, money. The time to be thinking about is not then. It's the long time before, and just putting your system in place.
yeah, we only have so much thinking energy and capacity in a day, in a week, in a month. And that's where we get in trouble. And, we all like to think that we can try to predict in time. And what about this? What about that? You think about in the last period of volatility, like, oh, well, the market's down or the market's, up. Would this be a good time to move my funds or do that? Like, the best thing that you can do is typically do nothing. When you start to recognize there's a level of humility that comes in, but there's also a level of freedom that comes into that. Like once I set the vision and set the plan, and you're automatically moving the funds and the markets and you're rebalancing, it's doing what it's doing, your work is done because you put the hard work up front and you set the cycles of automation in place. So yeah, I'm a firm believer in it's vision, it's goals, it's automation, and it's get the heck out of the way, the best that you can.
I had 3 of my brothers on the show about a month ago, and that was fun because we all grew up in the pharmacy. They took different paths than I did, but it was a fun episode for me. We talked a lot about how our dad, we kind of soaked business up from being in that family more than we thought we learned it. But with that said, we all agreed that it seems like some of the business and financial things we know are just inherent in human beings and are probably not. They felt inherent in us because of our upbringing. What are some quite obvious, and I know you don't want to pick on your clients, but what are some quite obvious things that you've seen that's like, it's kind of hard to believe people think that or don't know this? What are some real obvious ones that seem kind of like they're almost born in you, but not in others?
Yeah, the ones that are coming top to mind. I mean, I see a lot of kind of self-inflicted wounds on like a fixed income mentality that like, hey, I started here and this is kind of a ceiling. And I think it goes back to the story that we were talking about of, hey, I'm going to graduate with a doctorate degree. I've got a 6-figure income. And if you're hearing that message and adopting it like I was in my mid-20s, there's a real gift of having that income early in your career if you're able to leverage it and use it, time value money. But the curse of that is you're putting the ceiling right away in your mind of what is ultimately and I think a lot of pharmacists, to be frank, cannot break through that. And they're not aware of, Gay Hendricks talks about this in his book, The Big Leap, is that we create these ceilings where we live in this zone of kind of comfortability, and we have an upper limit of whether we're often not aware of it, it's in our subconscious, that we live within this mode of comfort. And so, that has a challenge to be able to break past it. The other one I see a lot, simple types of things is that the financial plan is as simple as you live off of less than you make and you allocate the difference to your various goals that you have. I think about that in my upbringing and growing up in small business and the lessons that we were taught. And I think to your point that you're making there with your brothers, some of that was learned behavior through just observing and really soaking that up. But that's the simplicity of the financial plan. Like you have so much of income, unless you can grow that, or we have to live off of less than we make and figure out what we're going to do. But despite the simplicity of that, the point I'm making here is to actually implement the behavior and the systems is the work, right? Is the real work. And there's a lot of overconfidence I see because of that 6-figure income. What often happens is that overconfidence kind of hits reality. And then I see a humility start to develop, 10, 15 years in of like, okay, maybe this isn't progressing along as much as I thought it would be.
Well, that's true because we think that we absorbed business stuff from my dad, but really maybe what we absorbed is the longevity of seeing him doing this for 40 years and kind of doing the same thing every damn day, going to work, investing, making smart decisions. And that longevity piece is probably what is ingrained in us, which some people just maybe don't have.
One other thing I want to add, I was just thinking about as you were sharing that is, it's one thing to know the calculations of compound interest and time value money. It's another to actually believe them and understand them in a way you're going to see them through. I often will share these examples and stories when I'm presenting with a group of pharmacists, and I'll have to pull out the savings calculator so they don't think this is just like my wonky math. But even with that, it seems hard to believe, right? If you say, for example, if you save a couple $100,000 in the first 5 years of your career, but when you wake up 35 years, that math tells us it's going to be worth a little over $2 million, meaning that 90% of that value came from the growth, not your initial investment. You can see that and understand it, but do you believe that enough that you're willing to set aside money each and every month, trusting in that? Because you can't feel it really for the first, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. until you start to get enough of a mass that you then start seeing it, right? When you get a portfolio, let's say you've got round numbers $1 million and the market goes up 7, 8, 9, 10%, could go the other way, of course. And eventually you start to get to the point where you see that at some point, this portfolio is going to earn more than I'm earning as a pharmacist. Like, it's easy to believe it then. It's hard to believe it up front when you're putting away, let's say 20, 25 grand a year. And you're like, I got real expenses right in front of me.
Tim, you're right as far as people's expectations, because if you were a pharmacist and went in some place and they said, we're going to give you $80,000 a year, your first question on your mind is, okay, fine, what's next? Where's the payoff? And how much ownership am I getting? And when is this going to go to 160 and 320? That's your mindset. But a lot of people, they come in and they hear the 137, 137, 137. That's where it goes. And they don't want it to go lower. They don't think it's going to go a lot higher. But you know, it just stays there. And we've seen what the numbers do then. It goes down.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons I think a lot of pharmacists aren't advocating for themselves in terms of salary negotiation and raises over time. You know, it's a comfort level, but it's a lack of understanding of, you know, if you make 135 and they give you a $3,000 bonus for your goodwill to the organization, but inflation was 3%, not every expense you have, of course, is going to be subject to inflation, but your purchasing power just went down. So, you know, I think this fixed ceiling and mindset has a negative because those early year raises, right? Everything gets factored in from those. Your next job that you take externally, internally, your percentage is going to retirement. All the things kind of start from that point. But what allows people to be successful, in my experience with negotiation, is when they kind of get out of that locked or fixed mindset where they say, well, wait a minute, what does employment mean? Well, employment, the definition of employee, you and I both know as a business owner, the only way an employee works is if that employee is generating more revenue than I'm paying them in salary and in benefits. That has to be the case, or else they wouldn't maintain employment. So if you understand that as an employee, now it's a value equation. Now, in some organizations, this is going to go farther than others, right? This conversation, but what value am I providing? Not what role or job title was I given? What's the return on investment? How could I potentially improve that? And am I willing to then advocate for that? And if you're that good and you're able to advocate, they're either going to recognize it or they won't, but there should be some other opportunities that are out there as well. But I would say 8 out of 10 pharmacists aren't comfortable having that conversation. And I think part of that comes from like that mindset right out of the gates of, hey, I make this and it's kind of that safe place.
Well, you're exactly right, Tim. And a lot of times, that's why some of the advice now is you got to switch jobs every 2 years to get this, because there's some employers that are like, we've got them mentally locked into this. We've got this range that we're comfortable with, that they're comfortable with, and we're not going to budge a whole lot from this. And I've seen it firsthand where sometimes the employee pharmacist is not comfortable with those kind of conversations.
Right.
And sometimes rightfully so, because being an owner, I've had it where people have come in and spoken for themselves and the value of this. I'm like, he's kind of an ass. I don't want to deal with that. I want the status quo. I like yes men, and I want people that are all going to be about this thing. And if I pay him 30% more, then what does that do for the rest of this and that? And I don't want people like that. I'm just saying that sometimes that nervousness is valid, but that's sometimes a reason to test it out and then take it to a company that does appreciate that. Because you might dig your grave a little bit with those conversations in that company, but that's something you have to face and you have to speak for yourself.
Well, yeah, and you have to understand your situation and understand your leverage and understand your employee and the organization and what are you trying to accomplish. I mean, if you come out with guns blazing, right, with no clear idea of what your role is or an overstated value proposition, you're absolutely digging your grave. And this could be a mistake early, in terms of, hey, I'm 2 years out, I've got all this experience and value to offer. Well, do you, right? Do you? And are there 10 people lined up, for the job that you have now that want it? So you have to understand the market dynamics. But if you are truly a key employee and person that's adding value and providing value, I think about this from the employer standpoint. As our business grows, unless I want to be in the business 40, 50, 60 hours a week indefinitely. I need to keep our key people to run the business and to provide the value and service that we want to provide to our clients, which means that, I need to have the right people and I need to retain the right people, which means that if there's a compensation problem that they're feeling that I'm not aware of, I do want to know that. Now, I'm not sure where we'll be able to get, but I don't want to find out about that in 2 years when they're going. So it can go both ways for sure.
Tim, someone is pulling up to the pharmacy now or home, they're listening to us. What's something that they could do with 30 seconds on their hand? Sign up for your newsletter? What would you suggest someone do?
Yeah, just go to our website, yourfinancialpharmacist.com. It's kind of a choose your own adventure of resources. So pick the topic, whether it's retirement planning, debt management, kids' college, home purchase, real estate. Find what's top of mind for you. We've got a library of free resources, and we've got a team of certified financial planners for those that are looking for that one-on-one assistance. That's the 30-second activity, and you can check it later when you've got more time on your hands based on what your interests are.
Tim, thanks for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you. There's not too many guests I have on that are important now, but also are important 50 years from now from someone listening to this and taking some action. So great having you on. I know you're busy. I appreciate your time. Our listeners do, and really nice talking to you again.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Mike.
You've been listening to the Business of Pharmacy podcast with me, your host, Mike Kelzer. Please subscribe for all future episodes.